Welcome back. Today we're going to talk about the history of herbalism. Some more we'll discuss from about 1500 AD on until close to the present time. So we start with, let me move my face. Okay, we start with Giambattista della Porta, right? You can say that while you eat spaghetti. So this guy he was really something. All around, did a lot of different things. Mathematician. He was very much into physiognomy, which, if you remember any history of psychology, this is this tradition where you believe that your internal traits are shown externally, so that you can look at a person at their physical appearance and be able to tell what kind of a person they are. So we know this is not how it is, but this was fairly popular for a while, not just back in his day, but also in early America, also actually in the 1800s in America. So physiognomy, being able to tell somebody's traits by their appearance, kind of related to something else that he was a big proponent of, which was called the doctrine of signatures. And so this was this idea that actually has been shared among many, many cultures. It started maybe originally the original proponent was Pliny, old ancient Greece. So anyway, the doctrine of signatures was this idea that plants, you could tell what a plant was good for by how it looked. And so, for example, walnuts look kind of like a brain, so therefore walnuts are good for the brain. And this is true for some plants. They do resemble the thing that they're good for. It's not true for a lot of other plants. They don't resemble the thing that they're good for. And so the doctrine of signatures, we'll talk about that in a second, was something that Della Porta really was a proponent of, and he made a difference in the world of herbalism because he was really pushing this. Also, he was kind of a beginning experimental person, using the scientific method before the scientific method was really a big thing. For example, he showed how you could write messages on eggs using some like invisible kind of ink. Well, it wasn't invisible at first, but when you washed the egg, then it was. And then when you would open the egg, you could see what was written inside on the egg, on the white. And so he would put secret messages in his eggs for prisoners of the Spanish Inquisition. That's kind of a fun, interesting historical side note about this man. He showed garlic did not disempower magnets. So people thought that garlic disempowered magnetic force. So he used an experiment to show that that's not how it worked. And so his were some of the first real experimental kinds of thinking before the scientific revolution really became a thing. All right. The doctrine of signatures. This might work for some plants. It's kind of more of a coincidence than it is really a thing, because there are lots of plants that don't bear a resemblance to the things that they're good for. And so you can't say that it works in all plants. But what we do think is that it was helpful for many cultures to look at it this way because it helped them remember. And so it was a mnemonic. It helped you recognize something. And then a lot of times when people see a few things that seem to correlate, we automatically make a principle out of it. We make it a rule without checking out to see if it really is a rule for all of the things. Just, it is for some of the things. And it's easy to jump from, well, this works for some of the things, to obviously it must work for all of the things. We do this across the board in our human logic that is not always very logical. So the doctrine of signatures, something that was popular, not really a thing. Then we come to Paracelsus. Now, Paracelsus had a lovely name when he was born, Theophrastus Bombastus von Hohenheim, right? And I think there might have been another name thrown in there too that I might have left out. Some people include it, some people don't. Anyway, so this guy, another big proponent of the doctrine of signatures, but he changed the course of herbalism and of medicine quite dramatically. He was an alchemist, and so he had this belief that minerals were very important, but he believed in treating diseases with minerals instead of with plants. And so part of this was from his experience being around mines and seeing some of the effects that minerals had on people, and deleterious effects for sure. And so he felt like mercury was a good plan to use to treat things. And mercury does get rid of some things, including your life. You know, if you remember, mercury was used to treat syphilis. And, you know, it would help with syphilis, but it also killed people because mercury is poisonous. And so he wanted to treat all disease with minerals instead of with plants, instead of with herbs. He was a believer that there were 3 humors. Like, you remember, Hippocrates was talking about 4 humors. A lot of ancient people would talk about some sort of method, like or a paradigm, like 4 humors or that sort of thing. And Paracelsus, he renamed himself Paracelsus, actually. So this guy was born with his regular name, and then he renamed himself Paracelsus, meaning he was more than Celsus, who was a famous physician. Thought, so he's better than that, so he named himself Paracelsus. I'm even better. And so his thing was, you have 3 humors, and it's salt, mercury, and sulfur. And those were the bases for his idea of how medicine should work. So he broke with herbal traditions. Some people call him the father of pharmacology. But what he really did was he got a lot of the world of medicine to switch from using herbs to using minerals. So he taught at the University of Basel in Switzerland. And at that time, all of their medical students were required to study Hippocrates and Galen, Celsus, Avicenna. So Paracelsus burned all of those books because he rejected all of those traditions. And he wanted to insist instead that people use the doctrine of signatures and that they use minerals like arsenic, antimony, lead, sulfur, and mercury. So, you know, all of those things are not really good for your body, but they are dramatic, and they do have an effect used carefully and in the short term. They're still poisonous, but carefully and in the short term, they may not kill you, at least maybe not right away. But another thing that he did was he developed this idea of dose response, that if you give a little, you might get a little bit of a response. If you give more, you might get more of a response. And so this holds true for a number of things. It doesn't hold true for everything. But the dose response idea was new to medicine, and that was a pretty big deal. Okay, so we have then the herbalist tradition, Paracelsus, who's now switching medicine to more mineral-based instead of herbs. However, then we also had the invention of the printing press, which made a big difference. And one of the things that started to be printed were herbals. And so when they say an herbal, what they mean is a book that contains information about herbs. They call it an herbal. And so if they say, do you have an herbal? You might think, an herbal what? Like an herbal tea, like a plant? What are you talking about? What they're talking about is a book. An herbal was known as a book. Books about herbs were known as herbals. And so the printing press helped a lot of herbals become published, which then led to lots of people being practitioners. Now, if you remember, the whole idea originally, and Hippocrates was a proponent of this idea, certainly not the originator, was that people could go out to their own backyard and pick herbs that were good for them and use them medicinally. Like Hippocrates said, let your food be medicine, let medicine be your food. This idea that what you eat makes a tremendous difference in terms of your health. And so there's this whole movement for people working to heal themselves using plants that they can access. And then a published herbal would just help more people do this. Then there's the other tradition that was more elitist based, which was essentially you need training, you need education, and complicated recipes for your herbal remedies. Like, if you remember, we talked about the Galen, that theriac that Galen improved and called Galen. Very, very complicated formulas that were then held by physicians as their own formula and expensive. So two kind of competing ways to look at using herbs. Then we introduced Paracelsus and his advocacy for using minerals, burning books of previous physicians so that he could make sure that his way was the way we did it. We had the Salerno, if you remember Salerno, Spain, that medical school that developed more standards for being a physician. Henry VIII also developed more standards. He wanted to control the herbalists by making them get a degree in medicine. But this requirement led to a huge shortage of doctors, because now if they have to get a degree, a lot of doctors weren't qualified. So this led to a huge shortage, which was a problem. So then he had to rescind that law and created something called the Herbalists Charter, which allowed for more herbalism and more herbalists. One of these guys was Culpeper. Culpeper published a lot of books in English, these books that were formerly only available in Latin or Greek. So he's making medicine and herbalism more available to the common person. So Culpeper in some ways did a tremendous amount of good for herbalism by making information available. But his own self, he was really into astrology, and he really held to this idea that all of the herbs cure all of the things. And so he didn't get a lot of respect because all of the herbs don't cure all of the things. He's a little over the top with that. And the problem here overall is that he damaged the reputation of herbalism because he was not a very critical thinker in that way. So thanks to Paracelsus, physicians break from herbs and they use minerals. They use something called heroic medicine. And so when you think about the history of medicine, a lot of times we think about, oh my gosh, they used to use leeches and bloodletting and all that. And this is where you see this tradition begin, this idea of heroic medicine. In other words, you bring the drama. Okay? If you think about, physicians wanted drama. They wanted to show that they were doing some tremendous thing that would then hopefully have an effect. And sometimes the dramatic things would have an effect. Sometimes the effect was that people just said no to, the last thing you wanted was a physician coming to the house, because there was a lot of death that would follow them because of these methods. Heroic medicine involved bloodletting. It involved something called calomel, which was mercury, cathartics. So you would administer cathartics and you would get violent laxative action. Now you can administer herbs that have a laxative action that can be gentle and beneficial and useful and not violent. But again, we're looking to bring the drama here because the drama really helped the physicians look like they were powerful. Emetics, vomiting, blistering. They would put substances on the skin to create blistering because the idea was the blistering would help the blood move out of the body. So in addition to bloodletting. So it was kind of called, you bleed, you blister, you puke, and you purge. And that was how people were so-called cured from their problems. Now, George Washington was a famous person who was given heroic medicine. One day he came down with a sore throat, and by that evening he was dead because of heroic medicine. He was given mercury, all of the things he received, the blistering and all that, and it killed him. So herbalists rejected this heroic medicine. They just noped it hard. They wanted to accomplish healing through subtle, gentle, and powerful effects of herbs. And so just because an herb isn't dramatic doesn't mean that it doesn't work. So we have to separate this idea of the drama from the benefit. We are still kind of stuck in this idea that you should have instant cure. It should be fairly dramatic. You have a headache, you want it to be gone in 6 minutes or something. If you have to wait 15 minutes, you're kind of like, wow, this is taking a long time. It should be completely gone. And the herbalist approach would be, there's a reason you have a headache. Let's fix the reason instead of just get rid of the symptom that says, hey, pay attention, watch out. So herbs and the use of plants to help the body heal itself instead of the administration of something that creates an effect that then the body has to deal with. So there are various methods and systems that then grew in America. The Thompsonian method, physiomedicals, the eclectics. These have eventually ended up in England, but I'll explain why. So we'll talk about these three traditions after we talk about this guy, Samuel Hahnemann, known primarily for creating homeopathy. So let me take a moment and discriminate for you the difference between homeopathy and herbalism. Lots of people get these confused. And so they use the term homeopath or homeopathy sort of as a catch-all term, thinking that it's the same thing as herbalism, when it's entirely not the same thing as herbalism. Homeopathy is this idea that like treats like, and if you give somebody a very, very, very small amount of the same thing that they're struggling with, that will help their body overcome it. And so they do a thing where they weaken remedy, and it's so that it ends up almost like the memory of the remedy in the water substance, and that's what they give you to suppress your symptoms or as a result of your symptoms to help you heal. Homeopathy, really different from herbalism. Herbalism is where you're using plants to create healing. Homeopathy, different thing. And so when you say, do you see a homeopath? You want to be specific that you're talking about somebody who actually uses homeopathy. An herbalist is not a homeopath. Two different things. Okay. So Samuel Hahnemann, however, was very important for the herbal world. He critiqued the use of herbals, you remember the books, because these books just laid out all the different plants and they didn't create any sort of experimental methodology to show whether or not something worked. And so we start having a number of people who are interested in the experimental method. So in the Age of Enlightenment, where we developed the scientific method, this started to become important across the board, and lots of people were very interested in using the scientific method to experiment and develop data that demonstrate whether or not something was useful, as opposed to just being in an herbal and carried through tradition. Tradition is valuable in many ways, but it also can be inaccurate. So sometimes you can write down something that you heard from, your wife's sister or something, and there it is in your book, and maybe it works, maybe it doesn't. But there's no guarantee that what is working in an herbal is really what has been working all along. You know how people write books and then the book gets told by somebody else and told, it's like the game of telephone, really. And so this guy, Samuel Hahnemann, came up with rules for testing herbs. And so he was sort of like the unacknowledged father of experimental pharmacology. His rules for testing herbs were like the scientific method. One of the things I find very interesting about this guy is that he suggested that you should test drugs on both men and women equally, which is something that uh, experimental methodology did not include for a long, long, long time. And it's only fairly recently that we're starting to see drugs being tested on men and women equally. Pretty recent stuff for that. And so here's this guy in 1755 to 1843 suggesting that we agree, yes, that's a good plan. Good call, Samuel Hahnemann. I wish people had done it that way. He also suggested that when you're doing an experiment with drugs, you should really strictly regulate the person's diet, which makes a tremendous amount of sense. He looked into cinchona bark, which is the first, we talked about that, Columbus brought it back from America, the first specific herb that would help with malaria. And so a specific in medicine is one thing that helps another thing specifically instead of sort of a broad spectrum. Samuel Thompson, probably the most influential herbalist in America, certainly for his time. He was the father of American herbalism. Very interesting story. So if you were ever interested, and this, again, introductory class, we're not going to spend a lot of time on all of these things, but you could go read a biography of his. This man had a lot of experience with people who valued herbs. He learned from a number of people the value of different herbs. He also asked physicians for help a number of times in his life, and every time was sorely, sorely, sorely disappointed, and turned to herbs and had wonderful results from herbs. And so he became deeply, deeply suspicious of physicians. And one of the things about him was that he thought, if you have gone to, school for this and you're educated in this, and these are your results, then I don't trust your education. Your education has no value if what you're doing is performing what they call heroic medicine. And so he developed principles of what was eventually called the Thompsonian medicine, a completely herbal approach that included also vapor baths and this idea that the body will eliminate what it needs to eliminate. Sometimes you need to help it. And then if you feed it, then you will have nutrition that will help the body heal. And so he developed a whole bunch of specific kind of formulas and an overall philosophy of how to be your own doctor. So this man was very much committed to that same ideal that Hippocrates had. So he was kind of called the American Hippocrates, because individuals going out in their own backyards, getting their own medicine, treating themselves, having the power to take responsibility for their health. So the Thompsonian medicine resulted in physiomedical movement, which also influenced the eclectic medicine movement. We'll talk about those in a sec. So Thompsonian medicine, the idea health and disease are a result of hot and cold. So cold is associated with death. Heat is associated with life and movement. His simple approach is that he would rely on steam baths to help people with heat to develop more vitality, more life. And then he would use emetics, which help, you vomit. Enemas help the body expel any disease from however you expel it. Vomiting through the skin, enemas, digestive, okay. So this was really different than heroic methods because this was gentle, plant-based instead of, cathartic and violent. And so you could see why he was suspicious of the book learning. Now, I think he went way over the top in terms of his suspicions. He threw out the baby with the bathwater for sure, because he refused the idea of further education. He really wanted something that the common man who was not educated could follow. And because he had been so damaged in his interactions with physicians who really harassed him a lot, he ended up rejecting all of education, really. Here's a quote. I think we never had more need to be on our guard than at the present time. The people are crammed with poison drugs, and the laws say they shall not examine and judge for themselves. The effects are pains, lingering sickness, and death. Poison given to the sick by a person of the greatest skill will have exactly the same effect as if it would if given by a fool. You could have made that quote today. He used herbs that he really, really loved. He really focused on lobelia and cayenne. There are a number of herbs he used, but those two were herbs that he just really favored for many, many things. He started off when he was young discovering the plant lobelia, which if you eat it, have enough of that plant, it will make you vomit. But if you don't have enough to make you vomit, it could be very, very beneficial. And so you kind of know when you've reached your maximum doses because you vomit and you're kind of done with it. And so he would give this plant to, like on a dare or something, to other kids when he was an adolescent and fool them into vomiting. But he started to really appreciate the healing qualities of the plant. So he incorporated it into his system of medicine. He developed this whole system of medicine, which then he patented and sold. And so that was some of the first forays into patenting a medicine. He patented his system, and it went across America like wildfire. People really loved the ability that they had to use his system, have access to his formulas and his herbs, and be their own doctor. His ideal was that you can be your own doctor. The irony about the physicians who were harassing him, suing him, taking him to court because they're claiming, well, lobelia is a deadly poison. He's like, well, okay, lobelia is poison, and you guys are using mercury and arsenic and strychnine and antimony, saltpeter, opium. Really? Really? This is your deal? You can see where he really was very suspicious of their education and became suspicious of all education in turn. So that suspicion led to a big division or a schism between Thomsonian herbalists and other herbalists who saw the value of a formalized education. And so the ones who saw that value and wanted that education, let's look at the sciences, chemistry, anatomy, physiology. There's a lot of value there. Thompson said no to any of that. And so this group of herbalists who liked Thomsonian medicine, but also said, education is a thing, let's do it, they call themselves physiomedicalists. And so physiomedicalism became another movement in America. Their theory is that vitality is a guiding principle. Now, vitality was something that many other herbalists had discussed, Thompson also. All beings have a vital force. You're alive, that's your vitality, that's the vital force. Your vital force separates you from inanimate objects. Vitality is a principle of energy. And the idea is that homeostasis is what the body does to maintain that vitality. Homeostasis is maintenance, and the body seeks homeostasis. So essentially, the body actively creates its own health. It's not passive. If you give the body what it needs, the body will heal itself. It has the ability to self-heal because of that vitalism. Okay, we're going to talk about this over and over because it's such a big deal in herbalism, this idea that the body will heal itself. And so if we think, what gets in the way of the body being able to heal itself? If you can't eliminate waste, that gets in the way. So if your system is obstructed in some way, it's hard for the body to heal itself because it's swimming in this waste. And if you don't have nutrients, lack of necessary nutrients will get in the way of your body healing itself. So the role of herbs, therefore, is to provide the nutrients to support the body functions, including you can use herbs to support the eliminative functions so that you can help get the waste out of the body. So this is a huge idea in herbalism, this idea that it's the body that resolves problems, not that the medicine forces an action, but you give the body nutrients and the body will resolve the problem. The body's an active player. So this differs because Western medicine basically assumes that the body is passive. And so you have to do things to the body to create an effect instead of offering the body nutrients and support, and then the body will create healing. And so just a thought question in terms of your body being an active player versus a passive player. Is there choice here? Is there choice that's involved? Does the body choose how to use what nutrients are made available to it versus chemistry making the body do a thing? Symptoms are one way of helping the body. And so in herbalism, we look at symptoms as these are the body's attempts to heal. These are the body's attempts to eliminate the disease. And so you want to help the symptoms instead of get rid of the symptoms. One example of that is fever. So you have a fever when you have an infection, other reasons too, but let's just talk about infection. When the body gets hotter and hotter, one of the things we know that happens is heat will kill a number of infections. Bacteria can't survive in the body. A virus doesn't survive well in the body when the body gets hotter. And so a fever raises the body temperature, thus killing the infectious agent. And so the herbalism approach is help the fever. Instead of lower or eliminate the fever, you help the body stay hot until the fever breaks. And then healing happens much more quickly after that breaking of the fever. The healing is what's going on all along, but you start feeling better much more quickly. With the caution that, of course, what you're wanting is not a dry heat, because that can be very dehydrating and dangerous, but a moist heat that can help the body with healing. And so overall, the idea is that you're helping the symptoms instead of stopping the symptoms. You're listening to the symptoms. And so the herbal approach is you want to increase that vital capacity of the body. You want to restore homeostasis, and you want to help with elimination as opposed to suppressing symptoms. So the result, you're healing the body with herbs without compromising the vitalism, the vitality, the body's ability to work on healing itself. That's compromised when you apply a medication that so strongly pushes a body action that it's not in keeping with how the body would solve the problem. All right, so then we have the eclectic tradition. So we had Thompsonian medicine, we had physiomedicalists, now we have the eclectics. The eclectics were very science-based. These were herbalists who said, if it works, we will do it. So very pragmatic, and they would include anything from all kinds of traditions as long as it works. So that's why you would call them eclectic. They're influenced also highly by the developing sciences, even more than the physiomedicalists who broke from Thompsonian medicine because they wanted to include biology, chemistry, anatomy, etc. And so eclectics really ate up those sciences. They were very interested in using the scientific method and promoting herbalism that way. They were very interested in using whole plants instead of extracts. And so that's also kind of a big difference in terms of thinking. The whole plant versus an extracted chemical or compound from that plant. The idea being that the whole plant contains a whole bunch of different things that work together, and an extract is one thing. And the plant may balance the effect of various extracts with other things that the plant has so that it has an overall beneficial effect. You pull out one constituent of the plant, then you don't have the other components with it. And so it's a little less predictable, and it doesn't really represent the whole plant. So eclectics and most herbalists are supporting the idea of whole plant usage. Dr. Worcester Beach, he was the one who really founded the eclectic movement. He was a regular doctor, so he had graduated from medical school, also had herbalism training. What he wanted to do was reform conventional medicine from the inside. As an insider, as a doctor on his own, he wanted to reform what was there, but that didn't work very well. He didn't like Thompson's rejection of college learning. He rightly so. He saw that as not useful. Like I said, I kind of understand it because he was burned, but his closed-mindedness, I think, was very limiting. And Worcester Beach saw the closed-mindedness as something that he did not want to share. So big advocate for learning from being scientific and then sticking with the herbalism tradition. So that's where America was. The AMA started, the American Medical Association started, and so you had conventional physicians, you had eclectics, you had various other methods, chiropractic, homeopathy, various other complementary and alternative medicine specialists, all operating, all kind of moving toward growing in that industry. And then what happened was the Flexner Report. I'm simplifying a little bit here again, but the Flexner Report basically was kind of a way of the Carnegie and Rockefeller associations having a say in terms of how medicine was practiced. You know, there was some funding of particular kinds of medicine that those organizations preferred. And then there was this Flexner Report, which was used to shut down a huge number of schools, herbalism schools, as well as conventional medical schools that didn't meet certain standards. And so in some ways, the Flexner Report was useful in terms of raising the bar, in terms of the standard of what kind of lab equipment had to be used, what kind of teaching was done, the cleanliness, this actual school itself, the quality of the school. There was a sense of let's level up, let's really create a very high quality education that was very much in favor of the experimental science that was seen in Germany at the time. Flexner himself was a graduate of Johns Hopkins, and he loved that school, and that school became sort of the gold standard for how medical schools should run. He was a big fan of this German experimental philosophy and using experimental medicine, this whole paradigm of hard-headed, maybe you could think of it as hard-headed experimental medicine that met those criteria, very much not in favor of any other kind of medicine, total disregard, wanted it shut down. And so this man's particular biases took over. So the Carnegie and the Rockefeller foundations were all part of the same thing. Flexner's ideas and biases, and then Carnegie and Rockefeller, what they wanted to fund, all of these things resulted in the impact of the Flexner Report, which ended up closing a lot of schools, closing over 80% of the herbalism and complementary alternative medicine kind of schools, chiropractic schools, homeopathic schools, etc., closing a number of conventional medical schools that weren't up to the standard, and resulting, especially in underserved places, resulting in an even more shortage of physicians, but primarily resulting in the near destruction of herbalism as a viable alternative to the conventional medicine. Here are a couple quotes. Dr. Duffy said this, Yale Journal of Biology and Medicine: "There was a maldevelopment in the structure of medical education in America in the aftermath of the Flexner Report." So what he's saying is, you know, the intention by Abraham Flexner may have been different than the actual effect. So I think the intention was probably better than the actual effect, being that the profession's infatuation with the hyper-rational world of German medicine created an excellence in science that was not balanced by a comparable excellence in clinical caring, which is something we're still complaining about today. You know, bedside manner, are people really interested in the clinical aspects? One of the, I'm talking in the middle of the quote, and so I'm sorry if this is confusing, but one of the things that has become apparent is that success in conventional medicine is very much a part of clinical care. And so that primary clinical care is the part of medicine where you can really develop success. The experimental, hyper-rational experimental method is not individualized. Primary clinical care is individualized, and that's where more success happens. And so here, this is an unintended impact from this Flexner Report, was this overabundance of laboratory medicine and experiments and research base that wasn't balanced with that clinical care. Another quote, 62 years ago, a man named Abraham Flexner was hired by John D. Rockefeller to evaluate the effectiveness of therapies being taught by medical colleges and institutions, with the ultimate goal of dominating control over pharmaceuticals. And so here there's some implications that what the Rockefellers and Carnegies were doing were protecting their investments in pharmaceuticals by shutting down the competition. And the AMA was certainly a part of this as well. They wanted to protect their people. Conventional medicine, that was their people. Herbalism, that was a competitor. And some of what happened in terms of regulations that were passed were regulations that favored conventional medicine and created a tremendous amount of trouble for any other approach. So getting rid of the competition is part of what happened. So after herbalism kind of crashed in America, in large part due to this Flexner Report, the three schools, physiomedicalism, Thomsonian medicine, and eclectic herbalists, they all moved to England, where they were integrated together and regulated, and now they're part of their professional system of herbalism in England. The standard of education was increased but narrowed. And so we had a better standard, but a very, very narrow standard that included this German-style experimentally based medicine. And as a result, herbalism as an alternative was pretty much destroyed. You had people kind of practicing on their own, doing their kind of own backyard folk medicine, but as a tradition and as a schooling, the eclectic schools, that sort of thing, pretty much disappeared. Recently, however, there has been a huge resurgence in interest in herbalism and a discovery of what's there, kind of a rediscovery of this history. And what I've seen, again, I had a longstanding interest in how nutrients affect mental health. And I remember looking for research in the 90s and finding very scant research in the 90s. But the 90s were already beginning to have much, much more research done on herbs as compared to decades before that. Since the year 2000, it's really exploded. I remember looking in the year 2000 at what was available in terms of herbal research, and now looking 20 years later, it is astonishing to see how much more research is being done. Herbalism is renewed and resurging and becoming a force to be reckoned with again. So that's it for today. Next time, we're going to talk a little tiny bit more about history and then about safety. And then you'll see, you'll have some clinicians speak to you via their videos that they have made for you so that you can kind of hear how they actually practice. Talk to you then.